But that means you've got to destroy Russian logistics, Russian headquarters, Russian artillery, and be able to sever the land bridge that connects Rostov down to Crimea, as well as this damn Kerch Bridge, which I am pretty sure will not survive 2024.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges served for 38 years in the US Army, commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. General Hodges, welcome back to Frontline.
James, thanks for the privilege.
I wonder if you can just give us your assessment of where we are in this conflict at the moment, in particular given President Zelensky is in Washington this week appealing for more military support.
Well, I think we are at a tipping point in this war. Clearly, Russia has failed to achieve its objectives, but it has adopted a long war strategy, attempting to convey to the West that they have endless resources by pushing in thousands of untrained troops into the meat grinder. They're willing to accept those kind of casualties for the purpose of conveying that they have endless resources. On the other hand, Ukraine has taken back half of what they lost to Russia in the initial invasion, or at least from February last year, but they have not been able to achieve the decisive effects that they need to actually win this conflict. This is not a Ukrainian failure. This is a failure of the West to commit to Ukraine actually winning the war and to deliver the capabilities that are needed to win the war. But that's where we are right now, and I think the coming year is going to decide the outcome.
It's interesting you mentioned the Russian casualty rate because, they are determined, it would seem, to encircle and capture Avdiivka. And a lot of people are saying, well, can they sustain these losses? But, US military intelligence saying that the entire Russian strategy now is to really undermine support for Ukraine from the West. And as you describe, what they're trying to do is give the impression that they have unlimited resources.
Right. Yeah. The Russians do not have, in my assessment, the decisive breakthrough capability. It's not like there are 3 or 4 Russian tank divisions that are waiting for some sort of penetration around Avdiivka that would then go moving rapidly towards Kiev or Kharkiv or some other major population center. They don't have it. So what they are trying to do is create the impression that Russian victory is inevitable, and they're counting on the West to fall short, to stop delivering the aid, the support that Ukraine needs. I mean, whenever people ask me why am I so confident or optimistic about Ukraine, I think, well, this has been going on for 9 years. Actually, Russia invaded in 2014, had every advantage, and after 9 years, they still control only 19% of Ukraine's territory. The Russian Air Force has not been able to destroy a single convoy or train bringing equipment or ammunition from Poland into Ukraine. The Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out, the Russian Navy out of the Western Black Sea, and Ukraine doesn't even have a navy. So, all these big pieces, you have to take that into consideration. Don't think just about what we see happening on the ground, which is not a good story for Russia. So I think that right now is the time when we should be saying, okay, look, even though we have not delivered what's needed, if we did, look at what could be accomplished by Ukrainian forces.
Talk me through, General, what would be the end game? Let's say that the West provides Ukraine with the support that it needs, the support that you've articulated, and they've got more long-range ATACMS, they've got the HIMARS, they've got the F-16s when they come into the front line next year, whenever that may be. Where do they target first? What is the key to Ukraine's victory?
Liberation of Crimea. That Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war, and I think that's what the Ukrainians are trying to do. Now they can't turn their back on other parts because they know that wherever Russia occupies land, Ukrainian civilians are going to be murdered. So they have to watch across a broad front. But it's the liberation of Crimea is that would lead to a decisive outcome, because that's really the only part of Ukraine that Putin cares about. And so I think if they can isolate and then make Crimea untenable for Russian forces and then liberate it. So I think most of what they're doing is going to be targeting, is aimed at doing that. But that means you've got to destroy Russian logistics, Russian headquarters, Russian artillery, and be able to sever the land bridge that connects Rostov down to Crimea, as well as this damn Kerch Bridge, which I am pretty sure will not survive 2024
That's interesting. Why do you say that?
because it's essential to liberating Crimea. That bridge, and plus it's such a symbol. I mean, when you can drop that bridge, destroy that, and sever the land bridge, then it becomes very, very difficult to resupply Crimea. They'll have to use ships to do it, which are even much more vulnerable. Um, so I think that bridge at some point in 2024 will be gone. It'll be a hell of an effort. And the Russians, of course, they know that how vulnerable it is. That's why they've taken some of these steps to protect it. But it will. I just think there's a lot of really smart Ukrainian special forces and engineers are working on how they go about doing that and what resources will be required. But in the meanwhile, I think they're going to continue going after logistics. We know from history that war is a test of will, it's a test of logistics. And if you can disrupt the other side's logistics, prevent the flow of ammunition and fuel and repair parts and medical kit, then you're going to win.
Just talk me through, if you can, General. If your objective was to destroy the Kerch Bridge, and you're right, it would be a huge moment in this conflict, how would you do it?
Well, I think this is a significant bridge. This is not a pontoon bridge. This is something that has substantial um, support, and you would have to knock out to really destroy it. I mean, you would have to have the explosive capability to knock out several of the supports, the pillars that are holding up this bridge. Now they'll probably be able to do some things like make it temporarily unusable. That's one thing, but to knock out the infrastructure that holds up the bridge would require real explosive power. The Russians know this, of course. So I think we'll see a combination of things, uh, innovative tactics as well as devices and methods of delivery that will do this.
Do you think there's almost a communications effort that needs to happen on Ukraine's part in terms of communicating its success, in particular with regards reducing the capability of the Black Sea Fleet more? Because you are right, it is an astounding success that a country without really any effective navy has been able to essentially eliminate the threat posed by the Black Sea Fleet, and yet you don't hear maybe enough discussion of it. Why is that?
Yesterday was one of the first times I've heard President Zelensky talking about that, and I think President Biden may have even echoed it. They talked about that a little bit in their press conference that they've opened up the western part of the Black Sea by pushing back the Black Sea Fleet. And I think that naval experts are taking note that the character of naval conflict, of naval warfare, particularly in enclosed seas like the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea, is changing, where maritime unmanned systems are so much more effective. And the long range capability of anti ship missiles is so significant that the idea of traditional surface warships, with all of the overhead requirement and their vulnerability in places like the Black Sea, this is something that I'm sure that the Royal Navy, just like the United States Navy, is closely watching.
Just on Avdiivka and its significance, does it have any strategic significance, General, beyond if the Russians were to capture it, giving Vladimir Putin something to sell to the Russian people in his election year, something to say, look, we're making progress?
So this is interesting. Vladimir Putin, unlike Western politicians, does not have to answer questions from a journalist. He doesn't have to face criticism from the Duma, his parliament. The Russian people, the election of everybody knows is a farce. So I don't know how much of this, what's happening around Avdiivka, is tied to his election, but it is revealing to me that he is reluctant to uh, do a mobilization ahead of the election. So that tells me that he is conscious somehow of what Russian people think. So if that's the case, and if Russia truly has lost 300,000 troops, I mean, that should be the core of an intensive information effort by the West to undermine what Putin is doing. He's going to keep going until he realizes he's lost, or until he realizes he's about to lose his own country, his people. So that should be our target. But instead, when he sees that the West, particularly in this case now the U.S. Congress, led by Republicans, is unwilling to continue providing what's needed, that's oxygen for the Kremlin.
When does the tipping point come, General, in terms of the Russian casualty rate? If they can't sustain these losses long term, when is the tipping point? Are we saying that it might be in 6 months' time? Are we saying it might be several years, or could it be far sooner than that?
Yeah, I really don't know because we don't really have a good understanding of what Russian people hear and think. Most of the casualties come from parts of Russia outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow. So as long as the people there don't see endless funerals, then I think this can go on for quite some time because he'll continue to find bodies elsewhere. That's why I think an intensive information operation that aimed at making sure that Russians know what's happening would be worthwhile. Also, the oligarchs, the people around him, they're not suffering. I mean, I think they have found a way to hide their money. They may not be able to go to the Adriatic Sea for their holiday anymore, but I don't know that the oligarchs are really feeling the pain yet. When they start feeling the pain, then I think there will be pressure put on Putin.
Is that an area where the West maybe needs to look again? I mean, if those around Putin, if the oligarchs, as you described, General, are not feeling the impact of Putin's illegal invasion, then shouldn't they be? And surely that's an area that the West can look again at.
Yeah, I think the Russian presence in London, for example, is not quite what it was, but you still have sons and daughters of these oligarchs going to school in UK and the US and Austria and Switzerland and places like that. They need to be sent home. I mean, these people need to understand that what they're doing has consequences, and right now, I don't think they really are feeling that.
We'll come back to Western support for Ukraine in a moment, General, because obviously that's the big issue at the moment. But I just want to ask you about some of the tactical problems on the front line that both sides are facing. First of all, the British Ministry of Defence says Russia is struggling to fight at night because of shortages of equipment, in particular night vision goggles. Even some reports that Russian soldiers are asking their families to buy them for them. What do you think that says about how well, or more to the point, how badly equipped Russia is at the moment?
Well, of course, when you're having to grab bodies from all over the place to fill up, to replace losses, to feed the meat grinder, you're not going to take the time to train soldiers how to operate at night. Giving somebody night vision device does not make them a trained night fighter. I mean, I have used night vision goggles, different types, for years, and it always takes time to get accustomed to be able to move, to use your weapon, to operate, to do things. And so the fact that they don't have, and I don't think they have any intention of issuing night vision devices to every Russian soldier, and they certainly are not training to the level to be able to use them effectively. So I would agree with that assessment that the Russians are not effective fighting at night.
And do you think, in a way, that is just because Putin's strategy seems to be to use a large number of his own troops as cannon fodder, and he doesn't see the need, he doesn't see the reasoning for supplying them properly?
Look, one of the biggest vulnerabilities of Russian forces is their logistics system. It was never designed to support long term, large scale operations outside of Russia. And so, something as simple as night vision devices. Now, number one, each of them are expensive, and the Russian military has a history, a tradition, if you will, of selling, stealing equipment. So I would be skeptical that they would even have what was issued to them. But from a logistics standpoint, the batteries required to do these things. I mean, this is a part of the logistics system that doesn't exist, and so I think that what we're going to see is Ukraine going after the Russian logistics system. President Zelensky even specifically mentioned that yesterday during his joint press conference with President Biden in Washington, where he talked about we're going to attack logistics. That's exactly what they should be doing. The Supreme Allied Commander General Cavoli said a few months ago the way you undermine Russia's only uh, advantage, which is mass, is with precision, and precision against headquarters, logistics, and artillery. So if we were to provide Ukraine with the capabilities to go after Russian logistics, it wouldn't matter how many troops they have.
Do you think the weakness in terms of the Russian logistics has been under discussed? Do you think it is the soft underbelly that maybe until now has not been exploited as much as it could have been?
I think that we just assume people just assume that they can keep doing whatever they're doing, and so we don't talk enough in terms of capability. All the conversation in Washington is about how many billions of dollars of aid, and what really matters is not the amount of aid; it's what type of aid are we providing, and what we need to be talking about is capability to help Ukraine win. That means air power, but also long range precision strike capability that could reach all the critical sites in Crimea, for example. I mean, the Ukrainians have proven the concept with just three Storm Shadow provided by UK. They have forced the withdrawal of a third of the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol. Imagine if they had 50, 60, 70 ATACMs, or I'm talking about the 300-kilometer range ATACM, or German Taurus. I mean, there would be no way for the Russian Navy or the Air Force to stay in Crimea, or the huge logistics base at Yankoy. Those places they'd have to evacuate. And so this is the kind of conversation we need to be having: capability, the capability to deny Russia the opportunity to stay in Crimea, make it untenable for Russian forces. Same thing for headquarters. It's not hard to find the headquarters, it's much harder to hit it. So when you find a Russian headquarters or you find logistics hubs, you hit them with weapons that can reach out 300-400 kilometers.
So why hasn't that air power been provided? You know, the West has been generous up to this point in terms of the money spent on military aid, but I was speaking to your former colleague General Philip Breedlove the other day on Frontline, and his frustration was so apparent. He was almost sort of figuratively banging his head against a brick wall with frustration at the failure to supply Ukraine with the air power support it needs. Why hasn't it been provided?
This is a manifestation of the inability of the West to commit to Ukraine winning. I mean, this nonsense about we're with you for as long as it takes. Yesterday, during that press conference, was the first time in 2 years I've heard my president say we want Ukraine to win. And the way he said it, it didn't sound like a new policy statement. It almost sounded like a slip. What matters is if we declare that our policy is that Ukraine wins, then what you see is a commitment to deliver capabilities that are needed. So, because I think the administration and others have been concerned about, oh, Russia might escalate, or how might Russia react, or what if Ukraine achieved catastrophic success, what happens then? That's why there's a reluctance to provide the capabilities that are necessary to help Ukraine win, specifically air power, uh, large numbers of tanks, and especially, I keep coming, I know I sound like a scratch record, but the effect of long range precision strike capability on the modern battlefield would be uh, significant. There is no one weapon, no magic thing that'll change everything. But if you give a capability to hit Russian headquarters, Russian artillery, Russian logistics, then I think you're going to see a completely different outcome.
You mentioned President Biden's comments there, General. Do you think that this will now lead to a fundamental shift in position from the West, that they are prepared to commit the resources required for Russia to be fully defeated?
Not yet. He did not. He said it. In fact, my wife and I were watching it on TV last night here in Frankfurt, and we both sat up when he said "when." Like, wow, I hadn't even heard that. But it didn't sound like it. He has to say it's our policy that Ukraine wins, because that will not only lead to the unleashing of capabilities that are needed, it also would take the air out of the Kremlin's hope that all they have to do is keep this going, this sense of inevitable Russian victory, and that they've got endless resources. When he hears that, that would undermine Putin's strategy as well. So that's what we need to have. Unfortunately, it looks like the Republicans, the party of Reagan, never in my life did I imagine that Republicans would be enabling Russian aggression, which is what they're doing by holding back on continued aid for Ukraine. Um, this, even though it probably gets fixed in January, the damage is done. And I think they've opted to focus on internal U.S. politics versus something that is extremely important to American security and prosperity, which is helping Ukraine defeat Russia.
And just to be clear on what Ukraine winning looks like, do you take it to mean reclaiming all of the territory that's been occupied since 2014, or do you think a Ukrainian victory could be something short of that?
No, I mean, victory is exactly what President Zelensky said. It's back to the 1991 border, 91, not 2014, 91. That means Crimea. Ukraine will never be safe or secure, and it won't be able to rebuild as long as Russia occupies Crimea. I think people, anybody that picks up a map and looks at the Black Sea and sees where Crimea sits, how can you even envision a situation where Ukraine becomes prosperous and its economy grows and when the access to the Sea of Azov, for example, is blocked by Crimea. And I think investors are not going to put money into Ukraine as long as they think that the Russians are going to resume this at the first opportunity. And I mean, you have a hard time finding evidence where Russia has lived up to any agreement. So why are people pushing for some sort of settlement where Ukraine gives up its sovereign territory? As President Zelensky said yesterday, there are people that live there. We're not talking about a patch of ground. There are people that live there. So I don't think he can accept something like that, nor should we. Why should Russia be rewarded for violating everything that's in the UN Charter?
Let's talk about the situation on the front line in Ukraine right now, General. Are you confident that Ukraine can make further gains over the winter months? Obviously, we're properly into winter now. The temperatures look to be even colder than they were last winter when it was relatively mild by Ukrainian standards. They have established a bridgehead over the Dnipro River. Are you confident Ukraine can make any further gains, or are we now at a point where we're waiting until a spring offensive?
I think that for the next few months, Ukraine is probably going to do the following. Number one, they're going to keep pressure on Russian logistics. They're going to keep pressure on Crimea. I think we're going to see continued sabotage efforts inside of Russia as well as occupied Russian occupied parts of Ukraine. Um, but they're going to take steps that will enable them to regain the initiative in the new year. That means, I believe, pulling out some units for what we call reconstitution. Units that have been in the fight nonstop for months. They need to come out, rest, refit, repair broken equipment, replace things that have been lost, bring in new troops, and train. I think some of that will be going on. I think they're going to be working hard to figure out how do they operate more effectively against Russian electronic warfare. This is an area where the Russians are really the masters. Is the electronic warfare. Ukrainians have got to be able to deal with that. I think they're going to be focused on improving their air and missile defense and the resilience of their power generation, which is obviously being targeted by the Russians every night. And they've got to fix their manpower system. Right, Ukraine has enough people, men and women, military age, to fight this war, but they do not have a good system for maximizing their available manpower. There are too many Ukrainian men and women, military age, fit and able, that are walking the streets in Ukraine. And frankly, there are thousands of Ukrainian military age males in Germany, Poland, and Romania right now. They need to fix the system and get those people back home where they can serve.
Just on the warfare point of view, do you think that Ukraine has made progress in that area? I only ask because, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the GRU, Ukraine's main military intelligence directorate, has reported that their cyber units recently conducted a successful cyber operation against the Russian Federal Tax Service. How encouraging is that, and do you think they're making progress in cyber warfare?
Um, Without a doubt. I mean, first of all, the Ukrainians are a very tech savvy people, much more than the Russian side, and I would expect that they are working 24/7 to find ways to not only protect their own networks, of course, but to exploit Russian systems, whether it's taxes, TV, and weapons production, all of these, all aspects. So yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot. But also, I think U.S. and UK and some others are probably doing a lot to help Ukraine in this effort as well.
So, if you are President Zelensky, then what constitutes success for the winter months? Is it consolidating defensive positions? Is it undermining the logistics of Russia's leadership? What constitutes a successful next few months?
Well, it's all those things I've listed. I mean, keeping the pressure on the Russians, don't give them a chance to strengthen, build up their logistics. There's got to be an intensive information effort trying to reach Russians. Do you realize that over 300,000 Russian troops have died? And to do what it can to undermine. So it's got to be a comprehensive, multi domain effort in the information space as well as cyber. And then, of course, the Ukrainians have demonstrated an ability using unmanned maritime systems to defeat Russian ships. I mean, one third of the Black Sea Fleet has had to leave Sevastopol just because of what Ukraine has done with the three British provided Storm Shadow and their own drones. This is going to continue, but they've got to also fix their manpower system, be ready with more manpower, and also with units that have been reconstituted, and I think also continuing to grow their own homegrown ammunition producing capability. Yeah, I live here in Frankfurt, Germany, and during World War II, German aircraft production reached its peak in 1944. That's after 2 years of intensive bombing by the Allies. So it is possible, even in wartime, to grow your production. I'm not entirely convinced that Ukraine is on a full wartime footing in all of its in the domestic sector.
It's interesting you mentioned you're in Frankfurt at the moment, General. We've talked a lot about the political debate in America about continuing support for Ukraine. But I mean, in Europe, the EU is not meeting its target of providing 1 million shells a year to Ukraine. And we had Ukraine's neighbour, NATO member Poland, demanding the full mobilisation of the free world recently, according to their new returning Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Just assess for me, if you can, Europe's positioning with regard to Ukraine.
I think people are finally starting to slowly wake up. It's unbelievable that Europe, with all of its industrial capability, still is not able to produce 1 million rounds of artillery ammunition, but it has the potential to do that. Does it have the political will? Recently, here in Germany, we've heard the defense minister talk about how dangerous the situation is and what Germany needs to do. And now, just the other day, the chief of the defense, General Royer, said that we are not prepared. We cannot stop Russia right now. So I think this is German leadership beginning to prepare their population like this is a serious threat. And if we allow Ukraine to fail, and of course, Germans are terrified at the possibility of a return of Donald Trump, what that would mean for American presence and support in Europe. Germans realize that they're going to have to do more. Finland has announced a significant increase in ammunition production. So Europe has the ability. Does it have the political will? We'll see.
Just finally, General, if you could have a word in the ear of General Zaluzhny, Ukraine's military commander-in-chief, and away from the politics of it, just focusing on the military side of things for the next few months, what would you be advising him to focus on?
I would tell him that we are learning from him. I am sick and tired of people in the Pentagon 5,000 miles away criticizing what he's doing. He knows better than any American or Brit uh, what is needed. He knows the Russians. He knows the terrain. He knows the people. He knows how to fight them. And I really think it's embarrassing actually when you've got Americans or British officers saying, well, they didn't do it the way we told them how to do it. That's bullshit. We would never send an American or British soldier into combat um, without having achieved total air superiority, provided them with endless amounts of breaching equipment and ammunition fire support. We'd never do that. And yet, to criticize Ukrainians, well, they should have focused on just one place. This is not the desert where you can make choices of one, two, three, or four axes. They're defending their country, and they have to, of course, think about how do they protect their people. So I think I have no advice that would be worth anything for General Zaluzhny, except I know he's doing all he can to make sure his soldiers are ready to fight, and I think that he needs to know that the West is committed to him being successful.
General Hodges, we always appreciate your insight and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
I'm very grateful for the privilege and the opportunity.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.